In this video, we're going to talk about Abbey Orchestra first violins. We're going to look at each control, what it is, and how it works. Starting in the top left corner, we have the LED light. When this is flickering red and green, it's an indication that your samples are still loading. Wait for this to be solid green before you hit play in your DAW or try and trigger any samples. Moving to the right, we have the CPU meter, which is an indication of how hard the processor on your machine is working. We then have the disk meter, which is an indication of how hard you're taxing the samples drive that you're streaming the samples from. The memory meter is an indication of how much content is preloaded into the RAM of your machine. We then have the voices meter, which indicates how many audio threads are streaming at any particular one point in time. We then have a refresh icon, which is useful for anything such as sticking MIDI notes. This option can be right-clicked, and we can see there are further options. To the right of this is the mode switching icon. Now, if you have both Core and Pro installed, you will have two different options here, where you can mode switch. Moving to the right, we have the MIDI channel option, which is where we can choose from 1 to 16 MIDI channels. To the right of this, we have a fine-tune and panning control, followed by a master volume. To the right of this, we have the preset settings, which is where there's a number of different options. At the top, we have the dynamics option, which changes the behavior of the middle fader in the interface. By default, this will go for full velocity range, which means that if you have this all the way at 0 and increase to 100%, you will increase through the dynamic layers. We then have a velocity mapped to dynamics option, which is where you can set these short articulations, such as staccato, to respond to the dynamics fader instead of how hard or soft you hit the key. We then have two compressed velocity options, which behave as MIDI limiters. This will limit the MIDI input performance to a particular dynamic layer. The velocities is where we can choose custom curves in order to set how the plugin responds to the touch of your MIDI controller. So if you have a controller that's really sensitive and it's really easy to trigger high dynamics from velocities, you might wish to set this to exponential negative. We then have the CC mappings option, which is where we can clear and reset the CC mappings. So by default, any control, when right-clicked, will have a default MIDI CC value, for example MIDI CC 1 for the dynamics fader. If I were to clear the CC mappings, we can now see that that has disappeared. Resetting the CC mappings brings it back and puts all parameters back to their default mappings. The sync to tempo option is used for the measured trems in this library. If you enable this, it will increase the CPU performance because you're continuously stretching those samples to the BPM of your DAW. The below three options, voice choking, roll end and soft takeover, are only available at this time for the percussion libraries. The short releases option changes the behavior of the release triggers in the library. The solo latch option we will come to later in the video, but that affects the way the solo and mute functionality works on the signal mixer. The Purged Unused option is a new feature of the Abbey Orchestra. This particular option is showing whether the setting Eco Load is enabled. This would be grayed out if Eco Load is disabled. You can do that in the main settings. I'd advise you to read more about the main settings in the user manual, but to show where Eco Load is, if we go into the interface options and scroll down, here we can enable Eco Load in order to purge techniques. So as you can see here, it's enabled. Moving down the interface, we have a collapse and expand toggle, which is where the interface can be closed and expanded. And to the left of this, we have a preset menu, which can be opened using the drop-down menu. On the left-hand side, we have a filtering system, which is where we can show the presets from individual libraries. The starred filter will become engaged whenever we favorite a preset. We can preview a sound, and we can also hover over the eye icon in order to get a little bit of information about that sound. The Core and Pro filters will become more useful as time goes on and we install more new products to this plugin. However, if we filter via core, as you can see, only the core patches are available. If I was to load this, you can see that the mode is now switched in the top of the preset menu. If I was to go to Pro, all Pro patches will be available. To the right of this we have the two arrows which move up and down the preset list in order. Please note that these work within the filters, so if I only had high percussion selected, it would only cycle up through the high percussion libraries. We then have the save icon, which is where we can save a custom user preset. That will then show up in the users filter at the bottom, which is where we can then have another little button at the bottom which will allow us to rename or delete that user preset. Moving down the interface once more, we have expression. This is a volume control which operates within the master volume of the library. We have the dynamics fader, which we've already talked about, which enables us to increase or decrease the dynamic layers of that particular technique. By default, the knob is set to reverb, but this can be clicked to see further options such as release, which allows us to extend the release triggers of the library, and also tightness, which allows us to cut into the start of the sample for a snappier response on short articulations. We then have a vibrato, which allows us to crossfade the vibrato layers. And we also have a legato offset, which enables us to hear more of the legato transitions. In the user manual, there are a lot of default values which are assigned to these controls. I strongly suggest reading the user manual in order to understand exactly how the positioning of each of these controls affects individual techniques, such as the legato performance patches. All these effects can also be found on the effects page at the bottom. Moving down the interface once more, we have the technique view, which is where we can see all the techniques that are available to us. To the right of the techniques, we have the technique editor, which is where we can choose to reorder techniques, delete them, we can preview techniques and learn more about particular techniques, and then we can save that custom configuration. To the right, we have the key switching options. Please note these work on a per technique basis. So for example, if I was to change the trigger method of the lyrical extended legato here to program change, I would also need to do that for every single articulation. And below the trigger method is where I can set the parameters. So if I was to change this now to CC range, here I can set the CC that I want to use for key switching and the range of that MIDI CC that I wish to use. The Activate button allows us to change the behavior of particular techniques to be a normal state of key switching, which is where they will change permanently. For example, they stay fixed. Or, for example here, if I was to change the lyrical extended legato to be latched, and I change via key switch to it now, it snaps back to the performance legato, which means I need to hold the key switch down throughout the duration that I want that technique to be active for. We then have the round robin options, which is where we can set the number of round robins to be limited for that particular technique. The reset on transport option allows the round robin cycle to be reset every time you hit play in your DAW. The reset from key enables us to place key switches on the keyboard in order to trigger specific round robins. This is particularly useful if there is a round robin that you don't like, so if there's a noise on it you can key switch out that particular round robin. The options allow us to stack multiple round robins up. This can give us a much thicker sound. There are more options if you change to the shorts, so the options here on the spiccato will give us a neighboured zones, which will allow us to borrow round robins from different keys in order to stack that same pitch on top of each other for more round robin counts. We have a transpose option, where we can see that the keyboard range is shifting, and also the below two options for two-handed layout and right and left mapping are also only available in the drum libraries at this time. In the top right hand corner we have the keyboard shimmier, which is where we can set custom ranges for the key switches, And we have a lock, which is where we can lock all this in place. Moving to the signal page, we have the preset options in the bottom left corner, which is where we can choose to load and save mixer presets. We then have the refresh icon for the presets also. The advanced view, when turned off, gives us a simple perspective of the mixer, which is where we can choose to dial in a close sound or a far sound. This will be reflected when you turn off the advanced view, and as we go back we'll see the ambient mic is the only one loaded. The global option allows us to set custom microphone mixes depending on the technique you have selected. So for example, if I was using shorter techniques, I might want to have tree 2 up, which is a lot more directional than tree 1. I might want to introduce some close mics. Whereas if I was to have the longs flautando selected, maybe I'd want more of an ambient mix because it's very atmospheric. And I could set maybe the outriggers and the ambient mics. So now if I was to go back to staccato, we can see that it's a different microphone mix to the flautando. We can change the level of any of these by clicking and dragging, and you will note that that is unloading the toggle at the bottom to remove that particular signal from RAM. We then have solo and mute buttons. By default, you can see that these solo buttons are not latching. There are a number of different shortcuts which you can use on the solo and mute buttons, which you can see the user manual for. But if I was to enable solo latch from this top right corner, we can see that these are now stacking. To the right of the signal mixer, we have the close and spot signals, which is where we can increase the stereo width and alter the panning of those close signals. We then have a left and right channel invert. Again, there is a padlock in the top right corner to lock all this in place. The effects we've already discussed, and these are all available on the knob at the top.
Thanks for watching Spitfire Clips. Let us know if it was too long, too short, too fast or too slow in the comments down below. Hit like if we answered your question and subscribe for more clips, tips, tricks and exclusive Spitfire content.